It had a zipper running down its belly, folding wings like a carrier aircraft, and enough range to cross the Atlantic, if you were brave enough. But somehow, this humble little wooden biplane also launched the national airline, survived impossible adventures, and became one of the strangest success stories in aviation history. Most stories have another side. This one's just a little stranger. I'm Bill, and this is Buffalo Air Park. Let's dive in. Grab a seat and get comfortable, because today we're talking about a Dragon. Not a fire-breathing kind, but the Havilland DH.84 Dragon. At first glance, it looks like a quaint little passenger airplane from the early 1930s. But once you start digging into its story, you realize this airplane seemed to have a habit of ending up in some of the strangest situations imaginable. The Dragon was born in 1932 because two completely different customers wanted two completely different airplanes. Airline entrepreneur Edward Hillman needed something larger than his Fox Moth to carry passengers between London and Paris as cheaply as possible. At almost the same time, the Iraqi Air Force wanted a light military aircraft capable of operating in remote regions. Rather than designing two airplanes, the Havilland essentially built one remarkable adaptable design that could satisfy both. The result was a twin-engine wooden biplane built around simplicity. Its structure was mostly spruce, plywood, and fabric. It cruised at about 110 miles per hour while sipping only around 13 gallons of fuel per hour. For an airline trying to survive during the Great Depression, operating costs mattered every bit as much as speed. In fact, the Dragon was so economical that it proved commercial aviation didn't necessarily need constant government support to survive. It could carry an astonishing payload for its size, something that made accountants just as happy as pilots. But then the engineers added one feature that still makes people smile today. Instead of hiding the flight control cables deep inside the airplane, they routed them beneath the passenger cabin inside a false floor. How do you inspect everything? You unzip the airplane. Literally. Running almost the entire length of the fuselage was a giant zipper. Mechanics could simply unzip the Dragon's belly and immediately access the control system. It's one of those wonderfully practical engineering solutions that sounds completely ridiculous until you realize how much maintenance time it saved. The Dragon even had folding outer wings, so airlines could store it inside smaller, less expensive hangars. Sometimes, the smartest engineering isn't glamorous, it's simply practical. And that practicality helped make history. In May of 1936, Aer Lingus began operations using a single DH-84 Dragon named Airliner, Irish for eagle. Carrying 5 passengers and a stack of morning newspapers, it flew from Dublin to Bristol, becoming the very first aircraft that would grow into Ireland's national airline. Sadly, during World War II, that same airplane was mistaken for a military craft by a German Heinkel HE-111 and shot down over the sea. Even peaceful airliners weren't always safe during wartime. But perhaps the Dragon's most famous adventure came in 1933. Legendary aviators Amy Johnson and Jim Mollison modified one by filling the cabin with 3 enormous fuel tanks holding roughly 600 gallons of fuel. There wasn't much room left for comfort, but comfort wasn't the goal. They named their airplane Seafarer and pointed it west. Nearly 39 exhausting hours later, after flying more than 3,300 miles across the Atlantic, they came within sight of New York and ran out of fuel. The Dragon crashed into a field in Connecticut, flipped completely upside down, and was destroyed. Remarkably, both pilots survived. Even more remarkably, they recovered the engines and instruments, installed them in another Dragon, and prepared to try again. That's determination on a level few of us will ever experience. By World War II, another unusual chapter unfolded half a world away. Britain needed every available aircraft at home, so Australia decided to build its own Dragons. The problem was that the main de Havilland factory was already busy producing Tiger Moths. So production moved somewhere unexpected. The storage area inside Sydney's Grace Brothers department store. Yes, people were literally assembling passenger airplanes inside a department store. Only aviation could produce a sentence like that with a completely straight face. After the war, surplus Dragons became incredibly inexpensive and found new lives throughout the Australian outback. Missionaries, bush pilots, charter operators, photographers. If someone needed to reach an isolated community, there was a good chance a Dragon would eventually show up. But the airplane also developed an unfortunate reputation for attracting unbelievable stories. One Dragon operating as a night ambulance over France was struck by lightning in 1936. The pilot safely landed on a beach, but darkness prevented them from moving the aircraft before high tide arrived. All they could do was watch as the Atlantic Ocean slowly smashed their wooden airplane into pieces. Then came one of the darkest incidents in its history. In 1935, two wealthy American sisters purchased every seat aboard a Dragon, flying from England to France. They claimed friends would arrive at the last minute. No one else boarded. While crossing the English Channel, both women opened the cabin door and jumped. The pilot, isolated in the forward cockpit, knew nothing until he suddenly noticed an unusual draft flowing through the cabin. It remains one of aviation's most haunting tragedies. Yet somehow, even the survival stories surrounding the Dragon seemed almost unbelievable. In 1948, Australian pilot John Spears ran out of fuel during a violent storm over Torres Strait. He managed to land on a tiny mud-flat island that disappeared beneath high tide. For 6 days, he survived on rainwater while sitting first on the roof, then inside the partially flooded wreckage, surrounded by crocodile-infested waters as the sea slowly tore the Dragon apart around him. Against all odds, rescuers eventually found him alive. Despite all its charm, the Dragon wasn't a powerful airplane. Its two modest engines meant that losing one while fully loaded often turned the aircraft into little more than a reluctant glider. Bush pilots learned creativity was every bit as important as skill. One famous pilot, Clyde Fenton, became stranded after landing on a soft beach. To reduce weight, he drained fuel, deflated the tires, and even tied the control column back with rope taken from a mosquito net because the airplane had become dangerously nose-heavy. Somehow, he flew it out. And perhaps that says more about the pilots than it does about the airplane. The Dragon demanded patience, judgment, and sometimes extraordinary courage. In 1955, New Guinea pilot Bill Paslaw faced every aviator's nightmare when his overloaded Dragon couldn't outclimb the rising terrain ahead. Knowing a crash was unavoidable, he deliberately steered into the left side of the gorge, sacrificing his own position to protect the passengers seated on the opposite side. One survivor later recalled Paslaw's final words, "Gentlemen, hang on tightly. We are not going to make it." Today, only a small number of Dragons remain, and fewer still fly. Some believe these fragile wooden airplanes belong safely in museums. Others argue they belong exactly where they spent their lives, in the air. Personally, I think they're more than museum pieces. They're reminders of an era when commercial aviation wasn't polished or predictable. It was experimental, sometimes uncomfortable, occasionally terrifying, and filled with people willing to trust a wooden biplane with a zipper underneath because it opened up a world that had never before been connected. And somehow, that little Dragon did exactly what it was built to do. And that wraps up another tale from aviation's stranger side. Until next time, keep your eyes on the skies.